Okay, so let's get right into it. Today's deep dive tackles the legacy of January 6, 2021. It's January 6, 2025, and wow, you've sent us a ton of material.
Yeah.
Online discussions, news articles.
Right.
We even have an editorial from back in 2021.
Interesting.
All looking at how this day is being remembered, or
Yeah.
maybe reinterpreted is a better word, 4 years later.
It is fascinating, isn't it? This isn't just about historical facts. It's more about how those facts are being filtered,
Right.
I guess you could say, through very different lenses today.
Especially with Trump back in the White House after winning the 2024 election.
Right.
It's hard not to think back to how he left office,
Yeah.
inciting the January 6th riots,
Yeah.
refusing to ensure a smooth transition for Biden. It's kind of ironic when you think about how Biden handled things in 21.
Absolutely. And Biden's recent op-ed in the Washington Post really digs into this. He sees this push to downplay or even erase January 6th from the narrative as a real threat.
He even uses the phrase, rewrite history, which feels pretty strong coming from Biden. Do you think he's overreacting? Or is this something we should actually be worried about?
I think his concern is valid. Look, we have these Reddit threads you sent,
Right.
where some users are incredibly cynical. They see Trump's return as proof that there were no real consequences
Yeah.
for what happened, that the system is rigged.
Like user Nemesense, who points out the legal penalties for inciting a riot,
Right?
especially when people died as a result. But Trump wasn't even questioned.
Exactly. And then on the flip side, you have users calling January 6th a nothing burger.
Right.
Like it was just another Tuesday in Washington. It's jarring to see such polarized views.
It's like we're talking about two entirely different countries, let alone the same event.
Right.
Some are calling it Trump's fascist coup, while others are dismissing it as just a bunch of rowdy tourists.
And that disconnect is where things get really interesting. How can a society function, let alone a democracy, when its citizens have such fundamentally different interpretations of such a pivotal event?
Especially when that event is as recent and as impactful as January 6th. And it's not just the interpretations that are different. Even the basic facts of what happened that day seem to be up for debate in some corners of the internet.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room, social media.
Yes. Elon Musk and the Twitter sphere.
Eh.
I knew we couldn't avoid that topic.
Well, it's impossible to ignore. Several comments allege that Musk's acquisition of Twitter directly impacted the flow of information, potentially even influencing the 2024 election.
Right, like Eugene 20, who describes Musk's takeover as, quote, easing the flow of right-wing content and suppressing its counters. But is it really that simple? Is Musk single-handedly responsible for these echo chambers we keep hearing about?
It's not just about one person, but the way these platforms are designed. They create echo chambers where you're mainly exposed to information that confirms your existing beliefs, even if those beliefs are, shall we say, factually challenged.
So we've got these wildly different narratives about January 6th, fueled in part by social media's tendency to create these echo chambers.
Right.
But there's another layer to this, right? The lack of accountability.
That's the crux of it. There's this pervasive feeling, particularly online, that justice wasn't served, that those who stormed the Capitol, those who incited the violence, got away with it.
It's hard to ignore that sentiment. When you read the People's World editorial you provided from January 6, 2021,
Right.
they wrote, quote, all of the rioting fascists should be arrested, charged, and tried for insurrection. That's strong language.
It is. And what's fascinating is that this editorial, written 4 years ago in the heat of the moment, now feels eerily prescient.
Because Trump is back in the White House.
Exactly.
And during his campaign, he actually promised to pardon those convicted of crimes related to the Capitol siege.
Precisely. And that raises some serious questions about whether the Department of Justice's response was adequate and whether true accountability will ever be achieved. It's no wonder people are feeling disillusioned.
One user, Volonic, puts it like this, quote, if someone tried to run people over with a car, he would be in jail for attempted murder, not given the keys back because he wasn't successful.
Harsh, but it makes you think.
That analogy really captures the sense of injustice many feel. But to understand this fully, we need to dig deeper into the People's World editorial itself.
Okay.
They go beyond just calling for arrests. They offer a much broader analysis of what led to January 6th.
Let's unpack that then. This editorial isn't just a reaction to the events of that day.
Right.
It's almost like a prediction of what was to come.
Yeah.
They wrote, quote, for those paying attention, it has long been obvious that Trump was a threat to the very survival of democratic government in this country.
Right. And remember, this was written before the attack even happened. They were already deeply concerned about Trump's authoritarian tendencies, his willingness to undermine democratic norms.
They even call him a fascist, which feels extreme, but their argument isn't just name-calling.
They draw a direct line from Trump's rhetoric, his actions leading up to January 6th, to the violence that erupted that day.
It's a compelling argument. They point to his efforts to delegitimize the election, his deployment of federal troops against Black Lives Matter protesters,
Right.
his constant stoking of racial and political divisions. They saw this all as creating a climate ripe for violence.
And it's hard to argue with that, especially knowing what we know now. But to be fair, not everyone shares that view.
Of course not. And that's precisely why it's so important to explore these different perspectives, to understand why people see January 6th so differently.
Okay.
It's not just about who's right or wrong. It's about understanding the deeper divisions within our society.
And how those divisions are being amplified and exploited by forces that benefit from chaos and instability.
Which brings us back to that fundamental question. How should we remember January 6th?
Right.
Is it a cautionary tale?
Yeah.
A turning point? Or something else entirely?
And what are the implications of those different interpretations for the future of American democracy?
Those are questions worth pondering, especially as we navigate these turbulent times. So we've been examining these contrasting narratives about January 6th, how they're shaped by social media, by the perceived lack of accountability, and by deeply ingrained political beliefs.
It's almost like trying to have a conversation in two different languages. How do you even begin to bridge that gap when people are operating from such vastly different sets of facts, let alone interpretations?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Especially when you consider the emotional weight this event carries. For some, it was a traumatic day that shook their faith in democracy, while for others, it's seen as a minor inconvenience, blown out of proportion by the media.
And it's interesting to see how those feelings are manifesting in these online discussions you've gathered.
Yeah.
There's this sense of resignation, almost despair in some of the comments.
Right.
Like they've given up hope that anything will change.
Yes, like the user special Pi9894 who writes, quote, "Stop telling us not to forget it. Nothing was done about it, so who cares anymore?" It speaks to a sense of powerlessness, a feeling that their voices don't matter.
That apathy is dangerous, isn't it? If people lose faith in the system and their ability to make a difference, it creates a vacuum that can easily be filled by those who seek to undermine democracy.
Precisely. And that's why it's so crucial to understand the deeper historical and political context of January 6th. It can't just be relegated to a footnote in history, a day of unfortunate events that we'd rather forget.
That's where the People's World editorial comes in.
Yeah.
They go beyond simply condemning the violence.
Right.
They argue that January 6th was not just a spontaneous eruption of anger, but rather a culmination of years of right-wing extremism and a deliberate erosion of democratic norms.
They actually call it, quote, the ultimate undeniable truth of the warnings they had been issuing for months. They draw a direct line from Trump's rhetoric, his actions, to the events of that day.
They point to his attempts to delegitimize the election, his constant attacks on the media and his political opponents, his embrace of conspiracy theories. They argue that this all created a climate where violence became not just possible, but almost inevitable.
It's a powerful argument, and one that resonates with a lot of people, even those who don't necessarily agree with the People's World editorial board's political leanings.
Right, because it goes beyond partisan politics.
Yeah.
It's about the fundamental principles that underpin a democratic society.
Yeah.
The rule of law, the peaceful transfer of power, the respect for differing viewpoints.
Exactly. And if those principles are eroded, then democracy itself is in peril. That's the message the People's World is trying to convey. And it's one that feels even more urgent now, 4 years later.
Especially when you consider their prediction that Trump, if given the opportunity, would, quote, completely destroy U.S. democracy.
Strong words, but were they being alarmist? Or did they have a point?
That's a question worth considering, especially in light of Trump's return to power. His actions over the next 4 years will be closely scrutinized, and the debate over his legacy and the legacy of January 6th will undoubtedly intensify.
It's fascinating to see how this is playing out in the online discussions as well. There's a real sense of urgency, a recognition that the stakes are incredibly high. Like the comment from Joost van der Leij, who writes, quote, "So much fascism coming in the next 4 years that this small insurrection will look like a walk in the park." They clearly believe that January 6th was just a taste of what's to come.
And then you have Boilermaker 11, who reminds us that, quote, Hitler didn't gain power from his beer hall putsch. He was elected after its failure. Remember that. It's a chilling reminder that attempts to overthrow a democracy don't always happen overnight. Sometimes they're slow, insidious processes that can take years to unfold.
And that's what makes understanding January 6th so crucial. It's not just about remembering the events of that day. It's about recognizing the warning signs, the patterns of behavior, the erosion of norms that can ultimately lead to the collapse of democratic institutions.
It's about learning from the past so that we can prevent similar events from happening in the future.
Precisely. And that's why I find this comment from Donkeltown so insightful. They write, quote, "The actual date of Jan 6 is better remembered as the death rattle of Trump's fascist coup rather than the substance of it."
So they're arguing that the real attempt to overthrow the government was the fake electors scheme, and that January 6th was just a violent outburst when that scheme failed.
Right.
It's a different way of framing the event, but it raises some interesting questions.
Right. It suggests that we need to look beyond the surface, beyond the dramatic images of that day, to understand the deeper forces at play. It's about connecting the dots, understanding how seemingly disparate events might be part of a larger, more coordinated effort to undermine democracy.
It makes you wonder what other pieces of the puzzle we might be missing. What else happened behind closed doors that we don't yet know about?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that historians and journalists will be grappling with for years to come. But even without all the answers, we can still learn from what we do know. We can study the patterns, the warning signs, so that we can be more vigilant in the future.
Because as you said earlier, the choices we make today will determine whether January 6th is remembered as an aberration or a turning point, a day of infamy or the beginning of something far more sinister.
And that's a responsibility we all share. We can't afford to be complacent. The future of American democracy may very well depend on it.
Okay, so we've talked about the contrasting narratives, the role of social media, the lack of accountability, and the deeper historical and political context of January 6th. But we haven't really addressed the question of what it means to remember this event.
It's not just about recalling the facts, although that's important. It's about understanding the forces that led to January 6th, the erosion of democratic norms, the rise of extremism. It's about recognizing the fragility of our institutions and the need to actively defend them.
It's about being aware of the warning signs, being critical consumers of information, and being willing to stand up for what we believe in, even when it's difficult.
And it's about engaging in respectful dialogue, even with those we disagree with. Because if we can't find a way to talk to each other to bridge these divides, then the future of our democracy is indeed bleak.
It's a daunting task, but it's one we can't afford to ignore. So where do we go from here? How do we ensure that January 6th is remembered not as a harbinger of things to come, but as a wake-up call, a catalyst for positive change?
That's the question we'll explore in the final part of this deep dive. We'll look at what steps we can take both individually and collectively to strengthen our democracy and prevent something like January 6th from happening again.
So we've spent this deep dive unpacking the complexities of January 6, 2021.
Right.
The contrasting narratives.
Yeah.
The unresolved issue of accountability. And the anxieties about what it all means for the future of democracy.
Right.
Not just here in the U.S., but globally.
And woven through all of that is the undeniable influence of social media.
Right.
These platforms, for all their benefits, have also become breeding grounds for misinformation, echo chambers that amplify existing biases and often make it nearly impossible to have nuanced, productive conversations about complex issues, like this one.
It's like we're constantly bombarded with information, but it's hard to know what to trust. And even when we do find reliable sources, it's easy to dismiss anything that challenges our worldview. We've all been guilty of that at some point, haven't we?
Absolutely. Our brains are wired to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs. It's a cognitive bias that's incredibly difficult to overcome. And social media algorithms unfortunately exploit that tendency. They feed us what they think we want to see, which often reinforces those biases and deepens the divides between us.
It's almost like we're living in parallel universes. People can look at the same event, the same set of facts,
right,
and come to completely different conclusions. And it's not just about politics.
Huh?
This affects how we see everything: climate change, vaccines, even basic scientific principles.
Right. It's a recipe for gridlock, for inaction, for a breakdown in trust, not just in our institutions, but in each other. And that's precisely the kind of environment where authoritarianism thrives.
Which brings us back to the People's World editorial. They warned that Trump posed a threat to democracy itself. And whether or not you agree with their assessment, it's hard to deny that something fundamental shifted on January 6th. It feels like we crossed a Rubicon and there's no going back. That sense of unease is palpable, even in these Reddit threads you shared.
Yeah.
One user, Midnight Shampoo, writes, quote, "What has changed me as a person is knowing just how many Americans are rotten to their souls." It's a bleak outlook, but it speaks to a deep sense of disillusionment that I think a lot of people are feeling right now.
It's like they've lost faith in the very idea of America. The idea that we can come together despite our differences, that we can solve problems peacefully through reasoned debate.
Yeah.
And if we lose that faith, if we give in to cynicism and despair, then democracy is truly in peril, because democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, engagement, a willingness to listen to those we disagree with, and to compromise.
So where do we go from here? What can we do to counter these trends, to strengthen our democracy, to ensure that January 6th is remembered not as a prelude to something worse, but as a wake-up call, a catalyst for positive change?
It's a complex problem with no easy solutions, but I think it starts with education.
Yeah.
We need to teach critical thinking skills, media literacy, how to evaluate sources, how to recognize misinformation and disinformation.
That's crucial, especially in the age of social media. We need to be more discerning consumers of information, to be aware of our own biases, and to seek out diverse perspectives, even those that make us uncomfortable.
We also need to create spaces for civil discourse, where people can engage in respectful dialogue across ideological divides. This means being willing to listen, to try to understand where others are coming from, and to find common ground.
It also means holding our elected officials accountable.
Right.
Demanding that they uphold democratic norms and principles, that they reject extremism and violence, and that they prioritize the common good over partisan interests.
And it means participating in the democratic process. Vote. Get involved in your community. Speak out against injustice. Democracy is not a given. It's something we have to fight for every single day.
At the beginning of this deep dive, we talked about how it's like piecing together a puzzle, trying to make sense of these fragmented narratives and conflicting viewpoints. But as we've delved deeper, I think we've uncovered something else, a shared responsibility.
Exactly. January 6th was a wake-up call. A reminder that democracy is fragile, that it requires constant vigilance and active participation from all of us. It's not something we can take for granted.
So for you listening, here's something to consider. What if instead of endlessly debating the meaning of January 6th, we focus our energy on strengthening the very institutions and norms that were attacked that day? What can you do in your own community to make our democracy more resilient?
That's a question worth pondering. As we move forward, grappling with the ongoing challenges to democratic institutions, not just here in the U.S., but around the world. Remember, the future of democracy is not predetermined. It's shaped by the choices we make, the actions we take every single day.